Rachel and Tom had been married for 5 years and had seen a lot in that time. Most of the problems of the young family had to do with their financial situation. At the same time, it couldn't be said that they lived very poorly. The young people worked tirelessly to buy their own home. But until they got the amount they needed, they had to live with Tom's mother, Barbara. Griffin was a headstrong and strict woman who wanted to control every step of her young daughter-in-law. Of course, she wasn't nearly as strict with her son, and always paid more attention to him than Rachel. That was partly due to the fact that the way Mrs. Griffin saw it, her son's wife wasn't a good match for him. Rachel grew up in an orphanage and was deprived of parental affection from an early age. The woman didn't know what it was like to have a family that takes care of each other. What can this orphan give you? She doesn't even know how normal relationships work, Barbara kept telling her son. To Tom's credit, it's worth saying that he never blindly believed his mother's opinion and always preferred to make his own conclusions. In turn, Rachel never stood up to her mother-in-law, as she understood that since she lived under the woman's roof, she didn't have the right to set her own rules. Saying that Barbara Griffin was a strange person would be a huge understatement. More than anything else, she loved to get involved in the young family's affairs, checking their income and expenses, as well as giving them unsolicited advice on how to live their lives. Barbara knew perfectly well that her son wanted to have a baby, and she didn't keep quiet about it either. "You'll never be happy with her, take my word for it," the woman said. Tom's father died of a heart attack 10 years ago, and ever since then, Tom's mother had become his closest person on earth. Tom could take any of his mother's outbursts, except for criticism of his beloved wife. He liked Rachel the moment he saw her, and therefore the man didn't want to argue with his mother about the choice he made. The absence of children caused a lot of tension in the family, and poor Rachel kept catching hostile looks from her mother-in-law because of it. It's hard to say how the story would have developed if one day Rachel hadn't found out that she was pregnant. The news made Tom the happiest man on earth. "Thank you, my dear," Tom whispered, hugging his beloved wife. Of course, the young people didn't see the look on Barbara's face at that moment. Deep down, the woman dreamed that her son would divorce Rachel and find himself a new life partner. The way Barbara saw it, Rachel simply couldn't bring anything but problems into her son's life. That wasn't true, of course, and Tom knew it better than anyone else. According to the doctors, Rachel was completely healthy and wasn't supposed to have any problems getting pregnant and giving birth to a healthy baby. To Rachel's surprise, the pregnancy wasn't all that difficult. The morning sickness and dizziness that so many pregnant women suffer from weren't all that bad in Rachel's case. The only thing that poisoned Rachel's life was the never-ending instructions of her mother-in-law, who wanted to control her every step and even watched her nutrition. "You shouldn't be eating so many tomatoes, dear. It can cause your baby to develop allergies," Barbara said, as if she actually knew what she was talking about. Rachel even tried following the advice of her mother-in-law at first, but then she gave up on it and started doing everything as the doctors and her own body recommended. "Why would you want to risk it? These aren't the kind of mistakes you could fix later," Barbara said, pursing her lips tightly. Tom stoically endured the squabbles between his wife and mother, mostly choosing to simply ignore them. But then something happened that changed the situation completely. That fateful morning, Rachel was supposed to go to the monthly checkup with her OBGYN. Since Tom needed to finish up his quarterly report, he had to leave for work earlier than usual, so Rachel decided to go home alone. Since the woman wanted to get some fresh air, she decided against getting a cab, as she wasn't far along yet. Rachel could still enjoy her walks. When she was about to leave the house, Rachel heard her mother-in-law scream angrily, "What do you think you're doing? Can't you wait for a bit so Tom can take you there by car during his lunchtime? Or at least get a cab? I don't think you should be walking around the city in your position." Rachel didn't say anything to her mother-in-law and simply left the house and headed towards the hospital. The hospital was a little over half a mile away from their home, so walking there couldn't harm the baby in any way. The weather was nice, and Rachel felt the warm rays of the sun on her face, as if a mother's hand was stroking her. Immersed in her own thoughts, the woman reached the crossing and, without thinking twice about it, stepped onto the road to get to the other side. For some reason, the young woman didn't really look around and recklessly relied on the drivers to stop in time and let her cross the road. Unfortunately, one of them went over the speed limit and, quite expectedly, didn't have enough time to slow down at the crossing. The squeal of the brakes and screams of the other passers-by rang out in Rachel's ear. Fortunately, the impact wasn't strong enough to cause Rachel any real harm, but it was strong enough to knock the woman down on her back. Rachel's head went dizzy as she felt a sharp pain in her lower abdomen. Despite the fact that someone called the ambulance right away, Rachel's health suffered irreparable damage. The woman didn't find out about it right away, but only after she came to her senses in the ICU of the local hospital. The first person Rachel saw was the on-call nurse, who was putting her on a drip. "What happened to me? Why am I in the hospital?" Rachel asked in a weak voice. "You're all right, ma'am. Just some minor bruises. You'll be fine," the nurse said. Having looked into the young woman's eyes, Rachel immediately realized that she was lying. "What about my baby? Is my baby all right?" the woman asked, getting agitated. The nurse seemed to be very uncomfortable and tried to hide her eyes by reading the patient's chart as if it was the most fascinating thing in the world. "No, this can't be happening. Tell me that it isn't true. No, I don't believe it." Rachel was hysterical, but the worst was yet to come. Tom and his mother arrived at the hospital, and if Tom behaved as befitted the loving and caring spouse, his mother wasn't as graceful and attacked Rachel with her accusations. "It's your fault that you lost the baby. Didn't I tell you not to walk to the hospital? Couldn't you have waited for Tom to take you there? Or take a cab at least?" Tears were flowing down Rachel's face. What she least expected to hear at that moment were accusations. The truth was that the accident could have happened to anyone, and it was in no way Rachel's fault. But there was no changing Barbara's mind. The woman seemed to literally be trying to incinerate her daughter-in-law with her eyes, accusing her of all mortal sins. Caught between two fires, Tom felt very uncomfortable. On the one hand, he was very sorry for his wife, and on the other hand, he understood that his mother only wanted the best for him and his family. But Rachel got the worst of it. The poor woman was feeling devastated. Not a minute passed that the young woman didn't reproach herself for choosing to take that walk. She was feeling so guilty that at some point, she simply started hating herself and her life. The worst part, however, was that the doctor said that after the accident, Rachel was unlikely to ever be able to have children. Since the woman's condition was unstable, the doctors decided to keep her at the hospital for a few more days. As befitted the loving and faithful husband, Tom visited his wife every day, bringing her flowers and fruit. Meanwhile, Barbara Griffin was grieving the loss of her grandchild. The woman took it so hard that her health started to deteriorate rapidly. One day, Tom returned home to find his mother lying on the floor of the living room. Mrs. Griffin was having chest pains and was breathing rapidly. "Mom, what's wrong? What happened?" Tom exclaimed. He realized that there was no time to waste and immediately called for an ambulance. Fortunately, thanks to her son's quick reaction, Barbara Griffin survived. Now Tom had both his mother and wife to visit at the same hospital. Barbara Griffin had complained of heart problems before, but after the events of the recent days, her health worsened significantly. According to her cardiologist, the woman needed to avoid any stress and anxiety. "You should probably hire a caretaker for her," the doctor added. It just so happened that Rachel left the hospital a week before Barbara was allowed to go home. There are no words to describe how unpleasant their first encounter was when Barbara finally came to the house, and it didn't get better with time either. From then on, every single one of Rachel's days was filled with pain and accusations. Barbara and Rachel were never on good terms, but the situation got even worse because Barbara could no longer take care of herself and required Rachel or Tom's assistance in everything. While Tom spent most of his time at work, his wife stayed home and thus got the worst of it. Taking care of her sick mother-in-law, Rachel couldn't help but feel guilty for losing her baby and causing Mrs. Griffin's heart attack. On top of that, not a day went by that Barbara didn't remind her daughter-in-law of the mistake she made. "If only you listened to me, none of this would have happened," the woman kept repeating virtually every day. At first, Rachel simply remained silent, stoically enduring all the accusations and hoping that her mother-in-law would eventually let it go. Unfortunately, it didn't exactly work out that way. When Barbara Griffin got a little better, Rachel could finally go back to work. Now she at least didn't have to spend her entire days in the company of her unbearable mother-in-law. But as soon as Rachel came home from work, Barbara immediately got back to it, showering Rachel with all kinds of accusations and criticism. Of course, poor Rachel repeatedly spoke to her husband about moving out of his mother's house and renting their own place. But her husband always countered with the question of who would look after Mrs. Griffin. "I'm sorry, dear, but we can't afford to hire a caretaker for her. And renting our own place would also cost a lot. I just don't earn enough," Tom said, lowering his eyes guiltily. Of course, Rachel understood that there was a lot of truth to her husband's words, and therefore she didn't argue with him but accepted her fate with humility. 10 years had passed, and during this time, Barbara Griffin had become even more unbearable. Since the woman was left to herself most of the time, she started spending time with her neighbor, and her son supported this friendship. Amanda Green was a local gossip who knew everything about everyone and shared that information with anyone at least remotely interested in it. Having quickly realized that Barbara didn't like her daughter-in-law, Amanda began to criticize the woman. Once, when Rachel came home from work a little earlier than usual, she involuntarily overheard a very strange conversation. When the woman came into the living room, she realized that there was a lively conversation between two friends happening in the kitchen. "Did you know that Tom picks up Vanessa Jones at his bus stop every day on his way to work?" Amanda said. "So what? Sure. Vanessa is a beautiful woman, unlike my daughter-in-law, but what does it matter?" Barbara replied. At that moment, Rachel turned pale, and a shiver ran down her spine. Meanwhile, Amanda continued, "Just think about it. What if they got together? Vanessa isn't married. She's pretty. Tell Tom to think about it so he doesn't miss his chance. Especially since your daughter-in-law is unlikely to ever be able to have children." A smile immediately appeared on Barbara's face. She definitely liked her friend's idea. Mrs. Griffin really liked Vanessa Thompson, whom Tom had known since high school. Vanessa came from a wealthy and influential family, and they could definitely help Tom build a career. Everything Rachel heard made her turn pale at first and then blush to the very roots of her hair. Having deliberately slammed the front door, she went into the kitchen and said, "Vanessa Thompson is certainly great, but doesn't the fact that Tom is already married seem to be a bit of a problem to you?" Amanda and Barbara looked at each other but refrained from commenting. The women were taken aback by Rachel's sudden appearance and her forwardness. Apparently, Amanda deliberately didn't mention that apart from Vanessa, Tom also picked up a couple of his other friends at the bus stop. There was definitely nothing going on between Tom and Vanessa. Rachel knew it, but her mother-in-law's words still hurt her deeply. The woman couldn't believe Barbara for the fact that while she was taking care of her, the old woman discussed Rachel behind her back and looked for someone to replace her. After that memorable conversation, Amanda always tried to leave her friend's house before her daughter-in-law came home from work. Unfortunately, those were far from all of the problems that Rachel would have to deal with. Few people knew that Amanda Green believed in all kinds of supernatural things and often went to see a psychic. So it was Amanda who suggested that her friend turn to a medium named Reginald Moore. "Go see for yourself. You'll understand it all when you talk to him. He'll tell you what's best for your son. To stay with Rachel or start a new life with Vanessa," Amanda whispered to her friend. At first, Barbara was skeptical about this idea, but over time, Amanda managed to change her mind, and Barbara finally agreed to see a psychic. That day, Reginald Moore came to Mrs. Griffin's home to hold the initial consultation. The medium turned out to be a tall man with a piercing gaze who knew how to suppress his client's wills and was capable of hypnosis. But the most interesting thing was the amount of money he demanded for his services. His prices were sky-high, which allowed the man to live a rich life. Seeing Barbara as a naive old woman, Reginald set about fulfilling his plan, skillfully manipulating Barbara's mind. The devious medium made the old woman believe that her daughter-in-law wanted to kill her. Moreover, he told Barbara that in order to prevent it, he needed to hold a special ritual to cleanse the house. Of course, all of this cost a lot of money, which Barbara Griffin stupidly took out of her bank account. Meanwhile, the con man went even further in his predictions and advice. At some point, the medium even turned the woman against her own son, whom she loved with all her heart. It wasn't hard to do for the skilled manipulator. One day, Rachel accidentally witnessed the ritual, which was invented by Reginald. Seeing Rachel, the medium pointed his finger at her and said, "Here, she's the reason behind all of your problems." That obviously wasn't true, but Reginald was great at reading his clients, and therefore he always tried to tell them exactly what they wanted to hear. Of course, Rachel tried to tell her mother-in-law that she was being played, but Barbara was already under Reginald's influence and didn't want to listen to anyone else. He was like a leech, slowly draining blood from his victim. Only instead of blood, he was sucking out Barbara's life savings. It's hard to say how this story would have ended if Rachel hadn't told her husband about the psychic. Tom didn't believe any of that magical nonsense, such as otherworldly forces or supernatural abilities. Having deliberately taken time off work to come home early, he caught himself witnessing another one of the con man's rituals. Seeing the psychic in the house, Tom immediately said, "Get out of here! Get out of here, or I'm calling the police." But it wasn't so easy to get rid of Reginald. He already felt the taste of money and wasn't about to lose such a great client. Trying to get the medium out of the house, Tom took him by the hand. At the same time, the man felt a sharp pain in his lower abdomen. Tom looked at Reginald and saw that he was holding a small knife in his hand, which he then quickly hid in the sleeve of his dressing gown. Fortunately, Rachel reacted in time and immediately called the police. Soon, the unfortunate psychic was detained and interrogated. As it turned out, he had many victims who spent their last money to pay for the services of the low-life con man. Fortunately, Reginald didn't cause any significant damage to Tom, as the knife only wounded the soft tissues, missing all the vital organs. Tom was discharged from the hospital a week later. Now all that reminded him about that awful situation was the thin scar on his abdomen. When the man returned home, the first thing Barbara did was apologize to her son. It was only then that Mrs. Griffin realized how awful she'd been and that her son and daughter-in-law only ever wanted what was best for her. This story could have probably ended there, but it didn't. About a month after Reginald Moore was arrested, Rachel found out that she was pregnant. According to the ultrasound, Rachel and Tom were expecting twins. This time, the woman didn't have any problems carrying the pregnancy to term, and 9 months later, she gave birth to 2 healthy babies. Now Barbara was happy to be able to help take care of her grandchildren all day long and enjoyed the fact that she was finally a grandmother. In the end, each of the heroes of this amazing story got everything they wanted, and all we can do is be happy for them and wish them all the best.